It looks like a town that was built over time. Ed Plaster, the village's chief architect and president of Ocala's KP studio, told the village's Daily Sun in April 2019. He was describing four new buildings going up at Brownwood Paddock Square: a courthouse, a saloon, a train station, and an ice plant. "We're trying to mix up some of the style," he said, "so that it stays fresh and looks like a town that was built over time, that there were different shopkeepers, owners, and building operators. Dated cornerstones, statues, and streets named for settlers and ranchers who never existed were all installed on purpose by a hired design team. Nobody hides this from the people who live there. Underneath it, the same ground has a real, documented history in county records and federal law. That invented version gets checked against the real record here, square by square, showing which parts of Florida's real past got borrowed to build it. Spanish Springs, Lake Sumter Landing, and Brownwood Paddock Square are the three original downtowns of the villages, and each one arrives with a complete written past. Plaques hang on building facades, and statues stand at entrances. Cornerstones carry dates decades before any of these buildings existed. Streets and storefronts carry the names of settlers, ranchers, and sea captains who never lived anywhere near this land. None of it was compiled by a historian or a local preservation society. All of it was written by a design team the developer hired, the same way a builder hires an architect or an electrician. Amanda M. Bryan, a historian writing in Southern Cultures in winter 2014, documented historical plaques on most of the storefronts across all three squares. This isn't a plaque here and there. It's a coordinated body of work, written to a plan, the same way a museum exhibit gets written to a plan. The objects come in every form a design team can build. Murals cover interior walls, and memorial benches carry inscriptions for people who were never born. Business names printed in square guides carry forward founding families that only exist on paper. Some of it hides in plain sight as a painted ghost sign, the kind of faded old advertisement you'd expect to survive by accident on a building that stood for 100 years. Here, it was painted on deliberately, new, as part of the original construction. None of this is a secret kept from the people who live there. Ask most residents directly, and they'll tell you the plaques are written, the same way anyone touring a movie set knows the buildings are facades. What's actually interesting is narrower than it's all made up. For every invented object in these three squares, there's a real record of that same ground. It sits in a deed, a plat, a survey, or a newspaper archive somewhere. Checking the two side by side raises a sharper question than whether the history is real. It comes down to which pieces of Florida's actual past got chosen to write it, and why those pieces, and not others. Spanish Springs Town Square opened in 1994, the first of the three. It stages a Spanish-American settlement from around the 1880s. Adobe-colored stucco, tile roofs, viga beams running through the walls, a central plaza built around a gazebo. Plaques around the square reinforce the same period. The building style alone does a lot of the storytelling before you ever read a word of signage. The record for this exact ground comes with a specific number attached. The pasture land that would become the villages sold for roughly $150 an acre in the late 1950s. Harold Schwartz bought parcels through the 1950s and 1960s, assembling the land piece by piece. It became a mobile home park called Orange Blossom Gardens through the 1970s. Still pasture in every direction beyond the lot lines. Spanish Springs itself didn't open until 1994. Built new with a Toronto design firm brought in specifically for the job. That firm's own records list the opening a year later in 1995, a small, sourced disagreement worth naming rather than quietly picking a side on. There's no documented Spanish colonial settlement, mission, or land grant on this particular stretch of interior lake in Sumter County. Florida's real Spanish colonial footprint sat on the coasts and the river corridors, St. Augustine, Pensacola, the St. Johns, a couple hundred miles from here. A Spanish colonial village reads as established and permanent. Recently converted mobile home park simply doesn't, which is most of the answer to why this particular story was worth commissioning. One building in the square, long known as the Van Patten House, carries a marker describing a supposed 19th century investor named John Decker Van Patten and his wife, Katie Bell. The marker ties them to a hotel venture placed on the site in the 1950s. A restaurant in that same building traded for years under the name Katie Bell's, and the name isn't a coincidence. Katie Bell was a real member of the founding family, Harold Schwartz's own mother. Her name got carried into an invented backstory about a hotel investment that never happened, on a building that was actually built new when the square went up. The building itself was converted into apartments in 2024, so the fictional 1950s hotel investors building became, in fact, real 21st century housing. Borrowing a real family name for a fictional character does something a wholly made-up name can't. It gives the story a texture that feels like it survived from somewhere, instead of arriving from nowhere. The real Spanish inheritance in this part of Florida wasn't architecture or settlement, it was cattle. Walt Disney grew up in Marceline, Missouri. When Disneyland opened in 1955, guests walked in through Main Street, USA, built as an idealized, cleaned-up memory of Marceline's own Kansas Avenue around the turn of the last century. It was never a literal replica. It was a composite, built at a scale designed to trick the eye. The ground floor sits close to true size, while the upper floors shrink down, so the street reads as bigger and grander than its actual footprint. Imagineers call a landmark, placed to visually pull a guest through a space, a weenie, a term fan historians trace back to Walt luring his own dog with sausages. The philosophy behind all of it got a name too. Imagineer John Hench described it as curating out every negative, unwanted element and building in only the positive, going beyond plain realism in some cases to make, in his words, a better show. Disney realism, he called it. The firm that built these squares has a name you can look up. Foric, a Toronto company, has a portfolio of more than 2,500 projects for clients including Universal Studios, Legoland, and Six Flags. In the firm's own words, it was on board from the beginning on the villages. Foric's earlier work wasn't theme parks at all. The firm's predecessor practice built ordinary landscape architecture around Toronto, including a public square at the Eaton Centre and parts of a university campus. That same design lineage later moved into building fictional 19th century American small towns for a living. Over a collaboration running more than 20 years, Foric built all 3 town squares. Its work covered more than the buildings themselves. It covered the full narrative and graphic apparatus that carries the invented backstory too, the signage, the plaques, and the historical graphics on the walls. Foric's own materials describe home sales at the villages tripling after the theming went in. That's the firm's own claim about the value of its work, not an independently audited sales figure, and it should be read that way. This isn't an informal creative hobby somebody picked up on the side. Theming, placemaking, immersive design, storytelling architecture. This vocabulary is now a university subject taught at schools like SCAD and Purdue, with its own trade association running conferences and setting standards for the field. What doesn't exist anywhere on the public record is a dollar figure for what any of this cost. No source lists a specific theming budget for the village's squares, and no reliable industry benchmark exists for what a themed downtown costs over a plain one. The fee stayed private. Only the result is visible. Walking distance from every home in 3 of these downtowns. The actual distinction is this: Disney's Main Street never claimed to be real history. It was a stage set built for a fictional mouse. Nobody walking down it in 1955 came away thinking Marceline's Kansas Avenue had been physically moved to Anaheim. The villages took the identical toolkit, the same vocabulary, a design lineage running through the same kind of firm, and applied it to a town where the audience actually lives. The backstory gets presented with the same weight as literal local history, not as acknowledged theme park fiction. Lake Sumter Landing is staged as a 19th century lakeside port, a working fishing and shipping town built up around its own harbor. The clearest example sits in a building that now houses an ice cream shop. A marker describes it as a small warehouse building on the waterfront, purchased in 1906 by a man named Oscar Feliu. Feliu, per the marker, ran a successful fishing equipment and bait shop for the sportsmen who came for the outstanding fishing available in the area. A second marker nearby tells the legend of Bocephus, dated 1879, in which two boys catch a legendary fish out of the lake. The lake itself is the record that breaks the story. Lake Sumter is man-made. It was engineered in the 1990s, years before this square opened in 2004. The real governing body for this commercial ground, the Sumter Landing Community Development District, was chartered under Florida law 2 years earlier, in 2002. No person named Oscar Feliu running a bait shop on this site turns up in any independent record. The plaques themselves credit a Lake Sumter Landing Historical Preservation League as their author, a fictional preservation society created whole cloth and listed on the signage as though it had been maintaining records for generations. A fishing town needs water and a documented history of people fishing in that water before there's a fishing town to write plaques about. This particular square got its water roughly a decade ahead of the port it supposedly served. The square's own name makes a similar promise in writing. Signage across Lake Sumter Landing brands the place, established 1841. Florida's Division of Corporations has a service mark registration on record for that exact logo. Filing number T050000001294, filed October 3rd, 2005, by the Villages of Lake Sumter Incorporated. The first use in Florida and anywhere was June 1st, 2004. The state's own registration carries a disclaimer on established 1841, meaning the registrant claims no exclusive rights to the phrase by itself, only to the full composite logo including the lighthouse, dock, palms, and text. That's the developer's own regulatory paperwork, putting the real date on record in the same government filing system that registers the brand. If you're following how this pattern works, subscribe to Florida Empire. There's a lot more Florida left to explain, and none of it's as normal as it looks. A beacon stands above the square, styled to look like a working maritime lighthouse. It's modern, decorative infrastructure built to withstand Florida storms. A longtime resident recalls it going up around 2004 or 2005, the same construction window as the rest of the square. A short walk away sits the Old Mill Playhouse, a movie theater built with a facade meant to evoke an early 1900s Milltown cinema. It opened on August 27, 2004, new construction from the same building campaign as everything around it, not a converted or rescued historic mill. There's one more detail worth naming here. The building that houses the square's radio station carries a telegraph office backstory, and the exterior photograph displayed on the building wasn't even taken at that location. A borrowed image propping up a borrowed history. A lighthouse is the fastest visual shorthand available for old working port that a design team could reach for. An old mill reads as a building that survives something, rather than what it actually is, a building built new to look like it survived something. Put together, The whole square runs the same pattern at 5 different scales: the water, the founding date, the beacon, the cinema, and the telegraph office backstory on the radio station building. Every one of them checks out as recent construction once you go looking for the paperwork behind it. A short distance from the market square sits a piece of ground the plaques never mention at all. Cherry Lake Cemetery is a real, still active burial ground used by a local congregation, older than the development around it, and set back from the main roads by landscaping rather than promoted with signage. Dozens of markers nearby narrate a detailed, invented settler history for this land. The one piece of ground nearby with a real, continuous claim to history carries no plaque explaining it to visitors at all. Brownwood is the newest and smallest of the 3 squares, open to the public on October 12, 2012. It swaps the coastal story for a cattle and timber frontier. Markers around the square describe a 19th century rancher named K.O. Atlas, whose dog trot cabin and cattle corral supposedly sat on this ground before he sold out to a Chicago businessman named William Brown. Brown, the story goes, developed the land and gave the square his name. The fiction actually predated the construction. In 2007, the Village's Daily Sun ran an article naming the design team behind the new square: Tracy Matthews, Vice President of Design, and Gary Mark, Director of Design, alongside a detailed backstory of rancher K.O. Atlas selling his land to William Brown. The invented history was running in the local paper as news 5 years before opening. No person named K.O. Atlas or William Brown shows up in any county history, deed, or genealogical record turned up by this research. Brownwood is a 2008 to 2012 construction. The newest of the 3 squares got, on paper, the deepest sounding roots of any of them. One part of Brownwood's fiction is visible in the building names themselves. Brownwood's first buildings carry names like the Palace Hotel, the Bunkhouse, and the Barnstorm Theater. Later phases added the 4 Plaster was describing: the Seabold Saloon, the St. Johns County Courthouse, the Sandspur Ice Plant, and a planned Brownwood train station, complete with fake rail tracks worked into the streetscape to sell the illusion. Bronze statues of cattle and a mounted cowboy stand at Brownwood's entrance, read by most visitors as a tribute to the town's ranching founders. They were commercially fabricated and shipped from a studio in Utah, installed when the square opened in 2012. That's the kind of paper trail a real 19th century monument would never have. Brownwood's cattle town theme didn't get invented out of nothing. Florida really did run on open range cattle for most of the 19th century. Sumter County itself leaned hard into cattle after its citrus industry collapsed in a pair of hard freezes in the winter of 1994 and 1995. Brownwood's fictional rancher borrows real regional texture, a real industry, and a real method of working cattle, then grafts one invented person and one invented sale onto it. That borrowed texture is worth following all the way back to where it actually came from. Florida's cattle economy traces back to Spanish colonists landing cattle here starting in the 1500s. With no fencing law on the books through the entire 19th century, ranchers worked true open range. Florida beef became a major supply line for the Confederacy once Union blockades cut off other routes north. Jacob Summerlin ran that supply chain at a scale worth sitting with for a second. Tens of thousands of head moving across open range, driven by men who cracked long whips instead of throwing lassos. The origin Floridians most often tell for the nickname cracker, though etymologists trace the term further back to an older English word for a loudmouth. The whole operation ran on almost nothing overhead. Cattle that fed themselves on wild grass, and land nobody had to buy because grazing rights on open range didn't require ownership. After the war, Summerlin found a second buyer south of the mainland and drove herds down to Punta Rasa, selling to Spanish buyers, shipping beef to Cuba, paid in gold coin counted out on the dock. That gold made him one of the richest men in Florida. And it's the standard example historians point to when they want to show how large the open-range cattle economy actually got. Sumter County built a real economy on citrus through the late 1800s, groves covering the rolling ground north and west of the lakes. Then came the Great Freeze of 1894 and 1895. On December 28, 1894, Orlando hit an all-time record low of 18 degrees, a record that still stands. A second front arrived February 7th, 6 weeks later, with temperatures reaching 17 degrees in places. Trees that had pushed new growth during the warm interval froze solid. Lake County alone lost 99% of its trees. And Lake County is one of the 3 counties the Villages spans. Statewide production fell from 6 million boxes of citrus a year to about 100,000. Land that had been worth citrus money became worth almost nothing overnight, until it was worth cattle. Sumter County farmers converted to cattle ranching at scale in direct response, since cattle didn't need 8 years to recover from a freeze the way a citrus grove did. That pasture, born specifically out of a citrus industry's collapse, is the same pasture Harold Schwartz would start buying up 70 years later. Schwartz ran a mail-order land business through the 1950s and 1960s, selling Florida parcels, sight unseen to buyers around the country, for $10 down and $10 a month. Congress ended that entire model in 1968. The Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act required anyone selling that many lots across state lines to register with the federal government and hand buyers a detailed property report before they signed anything. It killed Schwartz's business as written, so he pivoted from selling paper lots by mail to actually building something on the ground he still owned. That something was Orange Blossom Gardens, a mobile home park built with a partner named Al Tarson in the early 1970s. Growth was slow at first. Then Schwartz bought out Tarson's interest in 1983 and brought in his son, an advertising executive named H. Gary Morse, to run the community. Morse added a golf course residents could use free of charge, and sales took off, climbing to roughly 500 homes a year within a few years of his arrival. The community was renamed The Villages in 1992. Spanish Springs, the first fully themed town square covered earlier, opened its doors in 1994. The pace after that point is its own piece of documented history. By the early 2000s, the development was adding thousands of homes a year, a small city built inside 2 decades on what had been scrub pasture within living memory of people who bought their first lot there. Spanish Springs' 1994 opening is the exact point where everything invented across these 3 squares got built directly on top of the real history just described. A developer selling homes to people making one of the biggest decisions of their later life gets something specific out of paying for an invented past. It gives a brand new place what one historian studying the Villages calls a patina of stability and continuity in a location that's extremely new and still changing fast by any construction or demographic measure. Every invented story across these 3 squares borrows a piece of Florida's real past that's easy to sell: a Spanish colonial frontier, a fishing port, a cattle baron. Each one skips the pieces that aren't easy to sell: a federal fraud prevention law, a citrus industry wiped out by frost, a mobile home park that grew 1 lot at a time. The same pattern repeats across all 3 squares: real texture wrapped around invented specifics, built by the same design firm for the same reason. Once you see it in one plaque, you start seeing it in every one of them. Fooling anyone into moving here was never the point. Most residents who buy into Spanish Springs, Lake Sumter Landing, or Brownwood already know the plaques are written, and plenty could tell you which figures on them never existed. What the plaques are actually selling isn't a hidden history. It's a feeling, the sense of walking into a town that already existed before you got there, which is a specific kind of comfort a genuinely new place can't offer on its own. The real history of this ground, including open range cattle, a mail order business that a federal law shut down, and a mobile home park that grew into a city, is stranger and better than anything written on top of it. Florida keeps draining, inventing, and rebuilding itself like this, one engineered place at a time, and there's a lot more ground to cover. Subscribe to Florida Empire.